Hey guys, in this video, we're going to talk about the last chapter in the textbook, monetary policy. So we talked about fiscal policy before. So fiscal policy is any time when the government uses their tax or government spending to influence our economy. Monetary policy is any time when the Federal Reserve use the supply of money to influence our economy. So this monetary policy is all dealing with our supply of money. Okay, so remember, you're gonna hear this a lot and a lot in this chapter. All right, so first little review from previously. So known was the interest rate and the real interest rate, or investment real interest rate. So think about this real interest rate. That is the how much the interest rate is from your profit you get from the bank, or how much are you really paying for the loan on the bank. So from the previous, I believe this last chapter, remember for the Fisher equation that your real interest rate equals to your nominal interest rate minus inflation, right? That's your running out of rooms. That's your real interest rate. So it's like the profit you're getting from the bank. So imagine you go to the bank pays you 5% interest rate, and then let's suppose it's 1% inflation, then you're getting a real profit of 4%. Or vice versa, if you borrow money from the bank, so imagine that the bank charge you 5% interest on borrow money, and then there's actually an inflation of 2%, then how much are you really paying back? It's only 3% of the money, right? Because the inflation is eating away the nominal interest rate. So how much is the real cost of borrow money? Now, when firms investing in project, they're thinking about how much it costs them to borrow money. So assuming that firms will all borrow money for the project. That's not how you spell borrow. How they borrow money. And then they'll compare to see how much is the profit, the expected profit from the project, against how much the interest they're paying for the money they borrow. So imagine you run a project, and then the expected profit from the project is 10%, and then the interest you're paying for on this project is only 4%. Well, that's pretty good, because that means by borrowing the money, we can actually make profit of this project. But imagine it's the other way around, then you need to pay the bank back by 12% interest rate. Now we get a problem, because you borrow money that you need to pay the bank back by 12%, but you're only getting 10% from project. So you're actually losing money from the project, right? So that's how the firms make decisions based on the expected return of the project against the real interest rate of how much it costs to borrow money from the bank. All right, so and this is how the money market will impact the demand for investment. Now imagine that we have a smaller money supply. So money supply shifting to the left, and then your real interest rate is increasing. So the cost of borrow money increases. Then company, in this case, they will borrow less money, and then investment will be decreased. Now vice versa, if you have an increase in money supply, so interest rate goes down, and then company want to borrow more money. So remember this, between the interest rate the company pay for and then the amount of investment in the economy, they are inversely related. Okay, so if your interest rate goes up, then investment goes down. But if your interest rate goes down, then investment want to go up. Because if it's cheaper to borrow money, then company will borrow more money for project. All right, so for our another little review from previously. So how does interest rate affect our aggregate demand curve? Now remember, for aggregate demand curve, you have 4 components: consumption, investment, government spending, net export. And then for this chapter, for our monetary policy, we're going to focus mainly on this investment component. Okay, so how does investment change our real GDP, or in this case, aggregate demand curve? Now if you remember that if your investment increases, aggregate demand curve will be increased. If investment decreases, aggregate demand curve will be decreased. Okay, so so when you have an expansion of money supply, so more money supply available in the economy, they'll push your money supply curve to the right, and that will lower your real interest rate. Money is like anything else. The more you have it, the lower the price. So if you have more money supply, then the price from money will go down. And then the price from money is called the interest rate. So more money supply, interest rate goes down. When interest rate goes down, our investment will be increased, because at a lower interest rate, company will borrow more money for investment. And then when investment increases, this will increase your aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand curve will be shifted to the right, and you go from this Y1 to like a Y2. So real GDP is increased. Okay, so remember this little step over here. So increasing money supply will decrease your interest rate. The lowercase I is the interest rate, and that will increase your investment. The uppercase I is the investment, and that will increase your aggregate demand curve. So shifting your aggregate demand curve, oh, that's wrong. So shifting aggregate demand curve to the right, and that will cause a that will cause an increase in real GDP. Okay, so the economy gets better, and this is called an expansionary monetary policy. So anytime the economy is in recession, our government would use expansionary monetary policy. Now, vice versa, that if you try to lower your investment, this would lower your real GDP. So this is called a contractionary monetary policy. So let's suppose our government reduce amount of money supply, so less money available in the economy. The price from money will go up, so there's a higher interest rate. At a higher interest rate, our investment will go down, because company borrow less money now. Imagine you want to do a project, and then the bank will charge you 25% interest on the money you borrow. Then forget it, too much money, right? Costs too much money, so we don't do the project at all. So higher interest rate, lower investment, and that will decrease your aggregate demand curve to the left, and you're going to end up with a lower real GDP. So this is called a contractionary fiscal policy or monetary policy. Now this starts with decreasing money supply, which will increase your interest rate, which will decrease your investment, decrease aggregate demand curve. At the end, it will decrease your real GDP. So GDP goes lower. Okay, remember, if you have this demand pull inflation, or the economy is getting too hot, we're going to use our contractionary monetary policy to cool the economy down. It have a similar effect compared to your contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, so almost same thing, same intention, same goal. All right, so for our monetary policies, there's three components for monetary policy, three tools for monetary policy. The first one is called an open market operation. Now, I mentioned this briefly in the last topic for money. So open market operation is the buying and selling of government bond in the form of US Treasury bond to influence our money supply. So whenever our Federal Reserve buy or sell government bond, that's called open market operation. Now, this entire operation is all done at the New York Federal Reserve Trading Desk. Okay, so that where they'll go to Wall Street, they'll buy and sell government bond with the private market, with the public, and they will influence the amount of money in the economy and therefore influence our GDP. Now, for this buying and selling government bond, this especially when the Fed is buying and selling bond with people or other financial institutions such as the local banks, this will give them more money in the economy. So whenever government buy bond, so think about buying bond. So when the government is buying bond, they're giving us cash now, right? So they're giving the bank cash. So buying bond will increase our money supply, okay, to getting more money into the economy. And then with increased money supply, the banks will lend out more money, interest rate goes down, and then they will increase our economy, increase real GDP. So buying bond, that will increase money supply, lower, sorry, buying bond, that will increase money supply, lower interest rate, increase investment, and then therefore increase our aggregate demand curve. So if you draw one more line for aggregate demand curve, So this is AD1, then gonna shifting to AD2. Okay, so economy gets better, and that's called a expansionary monetary policy or open market purchase whenever the government buy bond. Now on the other side, if the government sell bond, when they sell bond, they're taking cash away from the public. So less cash available in the economy. Less cash available in the economy, so money supply decreases, interest rate goes higher, investment goes lower, and then your aggregate demand curve will be shifting to the left. So again, if you have a very hot economy or economy overheating, then you will use this, open market sell or contractionary fiscal policy. All right, the next one is the reserve ratio. So remember reserve ratio that in US for all the banks we have a fractional reserve banking system, that a fraction of the checkable deposit the banks must cap on hand as reserve, either in the form of currency or the form of deposit in the Federal Reserve. So they cannot lend everything out. That some of the money must be either kept in the bank or kept as reserve with our Federal Reserve. Now, this reserve requirement will impact how much money supply we have in the economy. Because remember this formula here, that your change in money supply equals to the money multiplier. By the way, this is the last chapter, okay? So equals to the money multiplier times the excess reserve. So this formula here is the same thing. So remember the 1 divided by required reserve ratio, that is your money multiplier. And then the changing reserve, that is your excess reserve, okay? So the changing money supply in the economy equals to the money multiplier times the change reserve. So suppose we have example here that our changing reserve is $10,000, and then the reserve ratio is 5%, and it's asking for how much is our money supply will change. So first, find out what's your money multiplier. So money multiplier equals to 1 divided by the 5%, which is 20. And the change in money supply will equals to the $10,000 times 20. The money supply will be changed by $200,000. Okay, so that's the math. Now, let's suppose we change our ratio. So this number here, we're gonna change it from, was it 5% to only 1% now. Now at 1%, our new money multiplier will be 1 over 1%, which will be 100. Now your change in money supply will equals to 100 money multiplier times your change in reserve, $10,000, and that will be a $1 million change in money supply. So by changing just the reserve ratio, we change our money supply from previously of 200,000 to now at $1 million, because this reserve ratio is changed. So that's how our government can use this reserve ratio to influence our money supply and also influence the economy. So to decrease, when we decrease our reserve requirement, so at the lower, so reserve requirement is lowered, then banks have a bigger portion of their deposit can be lent out as loans, right? So this will increase the amount of lending in the economy, which means it will increase our money supply and then decrease our interest rate. So so decrease reserve requirement, that will increase money supply, lower our interest rate, and then increase investment. That's an expansionary policy. Okay. Now, vice versa, if the government try to increase reserve requirement, so we're forcing each bank to hold on to more cash to reduce the amount of lending in the economy. So if the banks lend out less money, the money supply will go down and the interest rate will go up. Okay, so increase reserve requirement. So telling the bank, hey bank, stop lending money out now, lending less money out. Therefore, our money supply will decrease, so less amount of money in the economy. That will increase our interest rate, which means decreasing investment, and that's a contractionary monetary policy. So try to cool down the economy. All right, so let's look at this question here. So suppose Jen has $60,000 in government bond. She wants to sell $20,000 to use as a down payment on her home. If the Fed purchased the bond from Jen, the reserve requirement is 20%, and the potential change in money supply is how much? So if the federal government buys this $20,000 bond, the change in reserve is $20,000. By the way, you guys see me using the triangle very often. The triangle is called delta. It stands for change. Okay, so change in reserve is 20,000. Reserve ratio is 20%. So money multiplier is 1 divided by 20%, which is 5. And then the change in money supply will be $20,000 times 5, which is $100,000 of additional money supply in the economy. So answer is B. Okay, B is our answer. So when the Federal Reserve buys the bond from Jan, this actually increases our total money supply by $100,000. All right, next one is last one's called discount rate. So we mentioned this briefly last time too. So discount rate is the interest rate when the banks borrow money directly from Federal Reserve. Now remember, your bank, your Federal Reserve is the bank to all banks. So as individual consumers, individual business, we don't have an account with Federal Reserve. But if you're a bank in America, you must have an account with Federal Reserve. So for that account, the individual banks can deposit the excess cash with Federal Reserve. They can also borrow money from Federal Reserve. But whenever they borrow money from Federal Reserve, it's not free money. There will be interest on it. And that interest rate, when the Federal Reserve charge on the bank, the interest rate is called a discount rate. Okay, so discount rate is the interest rate when the Fed lend money to our local banks. That interest rate is called a discount rate. So discount rate. And then for discount rate, this can influence how much money our banks want to borrow, and therefore influence how much is our total money supply in the economy. So let's suppose we decrease discount rate, so make it cheaper for the banks to borrow money. Now, what do you think the banks will do? The banks will borrow more money in return, right? So imagine the Federal Reserve says, hey, banks, if you borrow money from us, we're going to charge you a 0% interest rate. Now, if I'm a bank, you know what I'll do? I will borrow as much money as I can. Because if the Federal Reserve charged me at 0%, I will borrow a lot of money from Federal Reserve, and then I will use the money, I will lend them out to my customers, and then I will charge them a higher interest rate. Therefore, the bank's profit goes higher, right? So a decreased discount rate, this will encourage the banks to borrow more money from the Federal Reserve, therefore increase amount of cash in the economy, and then increase our money supply. Now, increase money supply, this is the expansionary policy. So increase money supply, lower interest rate, and increase investment. This is all because we have a decreased discount rate. Now, vice versa, if you increase discount rate, so make it more expensive for the banks to borrow money, then the banks will borrow less money from Federal Reserve. They will offer less lending available for customers or for business, and therefore money supply will decrease, and then everything's reversed. Okay, so increase discount rate, that's called contractionary policy. So lower money supply, increase interest rate, decrease investment, and then your real GDP goes lower. Okay, so that's called discount rate. So there are three, these are the three tools for monetary policy: open market operation, reserve requirement, and discount rate. Now, the most used often is the open market operation. We do that all the time. The other two, with the reserve requirement and then discount rate, is not that often used, especially for reserve requirement. For reserve requirement, this let me go back. This is very rarely used, because if you lower reserve requirement, have the banks hold on to less cash on hand, that will make many banks more risky of bankruptcy. They actually introduce more risk in the financial system. So we very rarely change the reserve ratio. And then for discount rate, this has a limitation too, Because for discount rate, when you try to lower the discount rate, the lowest you can go, the lowest discount rate you can offer is 0%, because you cannot go below 0%, right? So if you try to use discount rate as the most often tool for your monetary policy, they can only go as low as 0%. You cannot go below that. That's the lowest limit. But for open market operation, there is no limit for it. So that's why if you look at who give money to our U.S. government for the government bond, Federal Reserve is the biggest holder of our federal government bond. So it's like the government lending money to itself, right? And the reason why, because it's our open market operation. Okay. All right. So next, know something called the federal funds rate. So federal funds rate, this is the interest rate when banks borrow money from each other. Now, so why would they do that, right? So normally, why would a bank want to borrow money from other banks? Because this money they borrow is all for short-term loans. So this you gotta compare to see what is the bank's required reserve and what is the bank's total reserve. So total reserve is how much cash they have on hand. Required reserve is how much cash they require to have. So if by end of the day that your bank might be short on cash, that the total reserve is less than their required reserve, then your bank will first call other banks, try to borrow money from other banks, just for very short-term purpose, like 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, until somebody come into the bank and deposit more money. But when they borrow money from other banks, there will be interest involved. Now that interest rate is called a federal funds rate. So it's the interest rate the banks charge from other banks when they borrow money from each other. Now, for even though this federal funds rate is between individual banks, but it still be targeted and also influenced by our Federal Reserve. So our Federal Reserve will set a target for our federal funds rate, and we're going to influence that with the amount of money supply in the economy. So if you imagine that your demand for a federal funds market, so the amount of money the bank borrow from each other, will be downward sloping. So the lower the federal funds rate, individual banks will borrow more money, but the higher the federal funds rate, individual bank will borrow less money. But for the supply of this federal funds market, it is strictly influenced by our Federal Reserve. So the supply for the federal funds market is flat. And then, so you guys haven't learned this yet, but if you ever take Econ 2002, this flat supply curve is called a perfectly elastic supply curve, because you're gonna think about this federal funds market and also the discount rate we talked about before. Now, discount rate is the interest rate the Federal Reserve charge on the banks, and then the federal funds market is the lending between each individual banks. So between banks. Now think it this way. Let's suppose when you go to the bank, other banks borrow money, other banks will charge you an interest rate of 5%. So 0.5%. And then imagine the Federal Reserve will charge an interest rate of 4%. Well, you know what? If that's the case, everybody will go to the Federal Reserve borrow money, and nobody will go to the federal funds market borrow money. Now that will lower the demand, which means will lower the interest rate here from 5 to 4%. So this federal funds market, even though it's between individual banks, but it's heavily influenced by our discount rate. Normally they're about the same. Roughly speaking, that if you look at the on most days in the financial market, the discount rate is just slightly higher than your federal funds rate. So federal funds rate might be so currently federal funds rate is about 0.15%. The federal discount rate is about 0.25%. So slightly higher than the federal funds market. So the banks will prefer to borrow money from each other, and then they will only use our Federal Reserve to borrow money as the last resort. So if they couldn't get money from anywhere else, then they will borrow money from our Federal Reserve, and they will charge them a slightly higher interest rate. Okay. All right. So whenever we decrease our federal funds rate, so lower federal funds rate, and this can be done whenever the Federal Reserve buy bond. When they buy bond, they give you more cash available on to the market, to the public, and the bank have more money to lend, and this would decrease. Actually, looks like decrease, but it's actually increasing. Yeah, you know, guys, this looks weird, right? It's because it looks like your supply curve is decreasing. But if you really look at how the supply curve looks like, normally it's like this, right? That's actually increasing when it's shifting down, okay? So that will lower the target for our federal funds rate, and that will increase amount of reserve in the market. Now, if you increase federal funds rate, this can be done when the banks, when the Federal Reserve sell bond. This will lower the money supply, and then, you know, the whole 9 yards, right? So lower money supply, increase interest rate, and an increase investment, a decrease in investment, and then decrease your real GDP. Okay, so that's actually done by increasing your federal funds rate. All right, little review. Show you the nice looking graphs before I finish. Okay, so let's suppose, you know what? Let me just use the PowerPoint. That's easier. So let's suppose right now we have a recession. So recession is by indication of the economy operating on the left side of your real GDP. Now, whenever this happens, the Federal Reserve will use the expansionary monetary policy, because economy in recession, we're trying to make it better. So that's called an expansionary monetary policy. Now, by doing so, we're going to increase our money supply. Okay, so expansionary policy, that's increase money supply. So money supply goes higher, so to the right, and lower interest rate. So when the interest rate is lowered, this will lead to an increased investment. So investment go from this point A to point B. And when investment is increased, this will increase our aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand curve will be shifting to the right. And we go from point A back to point B. So economy is shifting back to the long run potential. So economy recover from recession. Okay. Now vice versa, if you have a demand pull inflation, so economy is doing very, very good, actually doing too good, and then we're operating beyond our long run potential. If nothing happens, remember, if nothing happens, the economy will self-adjust. We're going to go to this point here, and the economy will end up with a much higher inflation. So to avoid that, we're going to use our contractionary monetary policy. So to cool the economy down, so cool the economy down, and then by reducing our money supply. So reduce money supply curve shifting to the left. This will increase your interest rate. When interest rate is increased, this will decrease your investment. So investment will be shifting, you know, from point A to point B. That's a decrease of investment. Decrease investment. This will lead to a decrease of aggregate demand curve. Okay, so at the end, for aggregate demand, we're going to shift back towards before. And go from point A back to the potential point B. So economy does adjusting back to the original point, the original inflation, and also real GDP. Okay, so economy recovers. All right, so guys, that's it for this chapter. Have any question, let me know. All right, bye-bye.